Hello, my name is Kevin Lindegaard, and thanks for joining us for the fourth Biomass Connect webinar, the regs, how to play by the rules when planting and using biomass crops. So frequent viewers of these webinars will know that we start off with a brief introduction to the Biomass Connect website, a nice big plug for that. And then I'll give a little bit of an overview, followed by the presentation of two expert panel members who will enlighten you with a great deal of information, followed by a Q&A session, and then the snippets about what's coming soon from the platform. Throughout the presentation, please use the chat function to ask any questions, and I will moderate those at the end of during the Q&A session. So yes, biomassconnect.org, the gift that keeps on giving. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, every day, virtually every day, we are adding new content to the platform there. So that means new videos, new technical articles, new events. So on a daily basis, if you subscribe, you will be getting to know all the things that are happening, which are very, very pertinent to you. So you could surf the web for hours to find this information, but what I suggest is you point your surfboard in the direction of biomassconnect.org. You won't be disappointed. So ladies and gentlemen, on to the main event of today, the legal nitty-gritty of planting and using biomass crops. Now, chances are most people that plant trees, especially on a large scale, or are using quite a lot of biomass in a biomass system, have taken or are looking to take the King's Shilling. Now, when you sign up to a grant or you are involved in a tariff-based system that earns you some money for burning this fuel, there is no such thing as a free lunch, I'm afraid. And what that means is that there will be lots of compliance to deal with. So you will be signing up for a 20-year scheme, and then you will have to deal with all of the things that involves. Now, there aren't too many 20-year decisions that you make in life. There's your marriage, there's children, there's your mortgage, planting a biomass crop, and using a biomass crop in a RHI accredited system. None of those do you want to go into lightly, I think you'll find. So knowing upfront all of the small print is very, very important, but it can be a bit of a nightmare, and there's no point in denying that because there's lots of small print to read. But what I say to my clients is that forewarned is forearmed, and it's really so much better to understand what you're getting into before you've signed the dotted line and you don't end up getting found out several years down the line for doing something that you wish you hadn't done, and then having to try and get yourself out of the tangle. That said, it's not easy, and it's it's full of complexity. So, which reminds me of a quote from Groucho Marx from the film Duck Soup. Now, in the film Duck Soup, Groucho is handed a financial report, and the person says, "I think you'll find this clear." And Groucho says, "Clear, huh? This is so clear that a 4-year-old child could understand it. Go and get me a 4-year-old child. I can't make head or tail of it." Now, I'm not going to give up the day job, which you'll be glad to know. But the reality is, you need more than a 4-year-old child with some of these legal documents. And in fact, you'll probably need a consultant in many situations, and a good one as well. And I'm delighted to say that we have two of the very best with us today to present on these very important things. So Caroline Eyre of Evolving Forests and Jill Alker of Clean Energy. Now, these two very experienced consultants will be able to cut through the red tape with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Caroline is previously the England manager for Confor, and I've known her for over 10 years, and I think that she is absolutely perfect for this gig because she is very much the sort of person that gets to the nub of the argument very, very quickly and we'll be able to cut out all of the background noise. So without further ado, Caroline, please could you tell us all about how to go about planting biomass crops and trees and keeping the right side of the law?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. Hi, everybody, I'm Caroline Eyre. As Kevin said, I was with COM for 14 years as England National Manager and recently have become Executive Director of Evolving Forests. I've been involved in biomass on and off for a long time. Just to note, my experience is in England, so I'll concentrate on what and where I know, but the processes in the other devolved administrations will be similar, but not identical. So as Kevin's already stated, I'm going to start with health warning number 1. There are 2. Woodland creation can be complicated. After all, it's a big land use change. And in the case of SRF or SRC, you have trees on your land for over 20 years. But I'll try and make sense of it today in the very short time I have available. Woodland. Woodland is defined in the UK Forestry Standard. The UKFS is the standard against which all woodland creation is assessed as land which is under stands of trees with or with the potential to achieve at least 20% canopy cover. The processes I'll cover to refer to any new planting that satisfies the above definition, including SRF and SRC. There are some really useful links at the end of my presentation that I urge you to consider looking at. One such document is the excellent Guide to Planning New Woodland in England. It's a 40-pager, but it includes everything you need to know about the process of woodland creation, plus additional useful references, diagrams and guidance on mapping and landscape context design, which I will come on to later. My one plea would be to engage with the relevant authority in your country as soon as possible after you've decided to plant. In England, that's the Forestry Commission. If it all seems too complicated, engage a professional agent who can go through this for you. After all, it's their bread and butter and that's what they're trained to do. You would be unlikely to build a house without the help of an architect, would you not? I suggest the same goes for creating a woodland or SRF SRC crop, and there are a number of regional databases for consultants, i.e. the Institute of Chartered Foresters, COM4, or even Come to Biomass Connect. Health warning number 2 is that in England there is little support under the current grant scheme, that's the England Woodland Creation Offer, for SRF or SRC that is or will be grown for biomass. However, there may be support in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, but you must check with the relevant authority as it may be on a case-by-case basis that support is available. So you've decided to plant SRC or SRF as a biomass crop. You now have to create a woodland management plan, which is step 2 in this slide. The process of designing a new woodland brings together your management objectives, the site's landscape context and silvicultural suitability, i.e. is it suitable to grow trees and produce the yield that you desire. Environmental, economic and social factors also come into a comprehensive plan that will make your woodland sustainable and UK Forestry Standard compliant. Once you've got your woodland creation plan in place, more detail on that to follow, then you have to submit an environmental impact assessment inquiry. Again, more info on that to follow. A period of consultation begins and then you submit your application for consent, including an environmental statement. You advertise your environmental statement and engage consultees, and then if all is well, you can go ahead and plant. I can't give you a standard timeline for the whole process because it differs depending on complexities and sensitivities of your site. Creating a woodland creation plan means you have to go through a robust process of scoping and surveying. Constraints check in this slide. The scoping stage is when you identify the potential for and extent of woodland creation on your site and who or what might be affected by it. The survey stage is when you identify the site's context, constraints and vulnerabilities so that the new woodland is designed to be sustainable and appropriate. At the scoping stage, you need to provide information about your site. The degree of detail you will provide will depend on the landscape context of the proposed woodland. Advice: producing a landscape context plan, a map showing the wider context of the site and highlighting relevant landscape and visual characteristics and site features will assist when scoping the proposal. You will also need to be clear about your management objectives. So I assume for this it will be biomass production. You will need to engage the local community, for example, through a parish council, and neighbours to seek their views. You may also need to engage with public bodies, especially if there are designated landscapes or protected sites or features on or near your proposed site. If you think your project could impact on neighbours or other stakeholders, engage with them at an early stage and tailor your conversation to the audience to make the best use of your time and the information they can provide for you. This can be a daunting and alien concept for landowners, but again, my advice would be to ask your woodland officer, that's a Forestry Commission woodland officer, for assistance. There's a best practice stakeholder guidance currently being developed in Scotland and Wales for woodland creation proposals. Finally, you will need to create an issue log. An issue log is a record of positive or negative considerations and actions taken or mitigations proposed during the planning and design process. Now you go on to the survey stage, if you're still with me. During the survey stage, you should collate and access information on the site's characteristics and landscape context, which will determine whether any follow-up surveys are needed to help develop your plan. Early engagement with the Forestry Commission, as I previously stated, is recommended to help provide guidance on the main types and level of information that you need to consider for your site. What I would say here is that the Forestry Commission's land information search is invaluable, and there's a link at the end of the presentation. When you're doing your survey, you should consider things like landscape designations. Are you SSSIs? Are you in an AONB or a national park? What soils do you have? Topography, climate, altitude, threats to young trees from browsing mammals, how these threats could be mitigated, i.e. through fencing or chewy tubes. And you also need to look at historic environment features, so scheduled monuments, access, terrain, biodiversity, i.e. habitat designations and protected species. To aid you, there are areas of low risk for woodland creation as mapped on the Forestry Commission's land information search. So these are areas that don't necessarily have all of these designations, but there isn't a presumption to plant, but there are less obstacles. You now have your UKFS compliant Forestry Commission approved woodland creation plan. Now it's on to the EIA process. So you've already done that. You've got to do it again pretty much. Firstly, you need to check the threshold tables. Right, even I struggle with this bit. So I'm going to try and explain it, but there's two stages. You submit an EIA inquiry form to notify the Forestry Commission or ask for its opinion. That's a stage 1 forestry EIA application, and it's determined by the project size and land sensitivity, often referred to as the thresholds. You may then have to go on to a stage 2, where you hold a scoping meeting, produce an environmental statement and submit an application for consent and advertise the environmental statement as agreed, i.e. in the local newspaper. The FC do their bit, and if all is satisfactory, bingo. Back to the thresholds. It's all about sensitivities and size. If your proposal is 0.5 hectares to 2 hectares and in a sensitive area, then you need to submit an application for opinion. If it's 2.2 to 5 hectares, and again in a sensitive area, you will need to submit an application for opinion. If it's 5 to 50 hectares and outside a low risk area, you will need to submit an application for opinion. If it's in a low risk area, you can submit a full notification. If your site is over 50 hectares anywhere, then you need to submit an application for opinion. So different notifications, i.e. application or full, are basically the same. It's on the same application form, but one takes longer than the other to process. And I see there may be some Forestry Commission colleagues on call, and if I'm right, I hope I'm right in the assessment of the thresholds. So more checks and balances. Most of the information needed to come to a stage 1 EIA decision on your proposal, and whether it requires a separate stage 2 application, is asked for on your FC administered EIA inquiry form. It is your responsibility to gather this information as evidence to support your application. However, Forestry Commission or your relevant authority also need to see evidence that you have engaged with local stakeholders and interest groups, and evidence from any field surveys or searches for constraints or features that may be affected by the woodland creation proposal. Once your application and supporting evidence is submitted, FC have set timescales in which they have to give you a decision on that EIA. But as mentioned previously, These can be protracted if the site is difficult or the supporting evidence is not complete. Providing an issues log showing evidence of stakeholder engagement and mitigation will help significantly your EIA inquiry to be processed more swiftly. If your project is considered likely to have a significant impact on the environment, an environmental statement as part of your Stage 2 EIA application will be required. There is a process of public consultation that goes with this. Yes, we've already been through this with the woodland creation plan, but I suppose with the EIA Stage 2, it's kind of MAC 2 stakeholder engagement. And again, your FC woodland officer will help you to identify key stakeholders and statutory bodies who may need to be involved in providing information that will help the preparation of an environmental statement, which is an essential part of the Stage 2. To note, most well-evidenced and well-designed woodland creation proposals do not require a Stage 2. It's not common actually. It's less common for Stage 2 to be required. But it comes back to your woodland creation plan. If you have a comprehensive woodland creation plan proportionate to scale and sensitivity of the site in question, it can really, really help your EIA decision to move much more quickly. We nearly made it. Woohoo! You've made it through the process and my presentation. So just a quick note to end. You must consider what the future land use intention of your scheme will be. An EIA has to look at the full life cycle of the proposal through to permanent removal. And here is the list of all the useful links. And if you're still with me and haven't fallen asleep, are there any questions? I assume that these will be circulated because those links really are really useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. The strapline of Evolving Forest says seeing the wood for the trees, which is just what you've provided, which is very welcome. We have a couple of questions and then we'll move on to the second presentation. The first one from Mary DiMambro says, it would be useful to know if any of these aspects are also applicable to agroforestry schemes, such as where several rows of trees are sown at regular intervals in arable or grassland fields.
It's the definition of woodland. So if it's 20% canopy cover, that it can include natural regeneration, then yes.
Right, okay, that's very interesting. So the other thing that I've got many questions, but the first one, am I to believe that if in England under 0.5 hectares and you can plant anywhere without doing anything, you're completely under the radar, and similarly in Scotland and Wales under 2 hectares, you can plant anything anywhere completely under the radar?
I think so. I'd need to check that one though, but it's very unlikely that you're going to have 0.5 hectares anyway, because it won't be economically viable for you to do that.
And say that you were someone who wanted to produce enough fuel for your boiler, and you thought, okay, I'm going to put it in strips and put it in different parts of the holding, and each of them are under 0.5 hectares. Could you get away with it doing that?
I would ask your Forestry Commission woodland officer to give you advice on that one, Kevin.
Perfect answer. Well done. Yes, that would be the consultant's answer I would give as well.
In fact, actually, FC has a new agroforestry advisor. So for all of it, I would really contact the Forestry Commission or your relevant authorities in the other countries as well, because they are the experts.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll come back with more questions after Jill does her presentation. So moving on to the other end of the spectrum of the biomass pathway. So if you want to use biomass in a biomass system, now that has its complexities as well. Now the RHI, for instance, has been a tremendous, the renewable heat incentive that is, has been a tremendous market pull for biomass into the system. However, it does come with lots of compliance and lots of complexity, lots of intricacies. And frankly, when you put all of the guidance notes together, which I did on one occasion, you come to about 700 pages, which is like a telephone directory. So you can imagine that it is a little bit like a Kafka novel, living in a world of Kafka tied in knots proportions. And basically, those 700 pages, of course, have almost a dual purpose, because on one front they can probably lead to sleepless nights, but on the other hand they probably are the cure for insomnia as well. So depending on which one you are, you'll be either awake all night or falling asleep. Now, this again leads to the consultants, and many a consultant, including myself, have done pretty well out of the RHI, because of course we've helped lots of different people through the process. But when it comes to a real difficult one, something that is slightly different, you'll probably need a very, very good consultant, someone who's been through many applications and has seen everything and been able to help everyone. So this is where Jill Orker comes in. So Jill has been involved in the biomass game at exactly the same length of time as me. And way back when, we were both involved in Willows, and whereas I've kind of gone away and then come back and now very much on the production side, Jill is very much on the consumption side, really looking at the use and compliance of biomass systems. And as I said, she's been involved in hundreds of applications and knows everything there is about this very complex issue. And I would like to say that based on that, she is probably the RHI consultant's consultant. So I'm going to pass over to you now, Jill, and I'm sure you're going to pass on all your many years of wisdom on this subject. Thank you.
Gosh, no pressure, Kevin. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Yeah, so to crack on, there's a lot to get through. Yeah, so I'm going to just do a very whistle-stop tour of some of the rules associated with using biomass crops. Many of the biomass use rules and regulations are designed to cover all bioenergy pathways, of which there are hundreds and hundreds, as you can imagine. Everything from using waste pig slurry in an anaerobic digestion right through to waste wood being converted into hydrogen for use in your car. So the regulators need to attempt to have a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation. And that basically means that any new pathway that anybody can think of to produce biomass is therefore already covered by the regulations. So the regulations generally cover these four things. Sustainability, which basically means that the fuel's been legally produced and harvested. There's the greenhouse gas emissions, obviously how many tons of CO2 are produced from the production and the use of that biomass. There's fuel quality, so making sure that the fuel's produced in the right way and burnt in the right types of equipment to make sure that local air quality isn't affected. So the local air quality emissions, it usually those sort of regulations are important both before the installation is built and also after the installation. Is it running and not affecting local health issues? And then finally, it's around ash disposal, and there's waste permitting rules associated with that. So those are the four things I'm going to cover today. The use of biomass to generate renewable energy, as Kevin said, is supported by a number of policy instruments. So unlike the planting and growth of it, at the moment there's no policy, but perhaps there will be. But for the use, there is definitely some strong policy instruments that the government's put in place. And it's really important to make sure that the crops that you grow, that you understand which of these different policy instruments your fuel is supplying into. So, for example, if you're producing a SRC that might go into a an RHI supported installation, you're going to have to jump through slightly different hoops from if you're supplying the same crop into an electricity producer. So because government is providing money to encourage these activities, it has a duty to make sure that those activities don't create unintended negative effects. So there's often a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to make sure that that money is appropriately being spent. And as I said, not all pathways and not all uses are necessarily a positive when it comes to biomass. So when it comes to regulation, also size is very important. So the smaller systems tend to be slightly less regulated than the big ones. It's also important for you to be able to identify which of these regulations is important to you. If you're a if you're a supplier, you might not need to worry about some of the regulations that apply to users, but you might be a supplier and a user, so you might need to look at all of these. And so I've tried to help through this presentation by colour coding the different sections depending on which of these you are. And if you're a supplier, look at the yellow sections. If you're a user, look at the blue. If you think you might be both, then look at the green sections. The regulations also differ between woody crops and grassy crops, so I've tried to point those differences out. And it's worth saying that even if you are supplying a crop or you have a system that is not accredited to one of these policy instruments, so you're not receiving money for producing renewable energy from any of these things, there are still rules that you've got to hoops that you've got to jump through, and particularly the ones relating to environmental permitting. So let's jump into sustainability, and I'm going to start off with heat uses. So the main one being renewable heat incentive, which Kevin's mentioned before. So there's 3 different ways that you can demonstrate sustainability. The first being the biomass suppliers list, which is administered by Woodshaw. This is for woody crops, so short rotation coppice and short rotation forestry. And basically the BSL biomass suppliers list will check that the land criteria, so whether whether the fuel has been harvested legally. In almost all cases it will be for energy crops, but they have to check that, and they'll check the greenhouse gas emissions of the supply chain, so everything from the point of planting the crop right through to the point at which it's being used in the boiler. And the greenhouse gas emissions have to be below this 34.8 grams for it to be eligible to get a BSL number. Once you've got that BSL number, then you will be issued with it, and BSL then issue a list of all the valid RHI numbers to Ofgem. When you've got your BSL number and you make your first delivery, you will then invoice your customer with the number on that invoice. And the customer will then take the number off the invoice and they'll put that into their quarterly RHI return, which is submitted to Ofgem. And Ofgem will check that BSL number against the valid list that BSL have supplied to them. And if the number's not on the list, then you don't get paid. Additionally, the supplier must then report the amount of fuel that it's supplied to all its customers back to BSL. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of cross-checking between BSL and Ofgem to make sure everybody's doing the right thing. And then the supplier then also pays an annual subscription and a quarterly amount to BSL for administration purposes to cover the costs of administration. And there's regular audits from BSL. It requires good record keeping. An additional requirement now that's just come in on the 1st of April last year is that in order to get a BSL number, you have to be Woodshaw or N+ accredited, and I'll talk about that later. Second way of becoming sustainably approved is through the Sustainable Fuels Register. This is for non-woody fuels, so things like miscanthus or switchgrass or anything other than wood, basically. This is administered by the NFU Energy and by Crops for Energy. Kevin knows a lot more about this because this is his thing. So if you have any questions, please ask him later. But it's essentially the same, more or less it's the same as BSL, but for non-woody crops. And the third option is what's called self-reporting. So self-reporting, anybody can use self-reporting, and it's a way of avoiding having to do BSL and SFR. I would say, though, that it is more onerous than either of those two. So don't do it unless you have to, but you do have to do it if you've got a system that's bigger than 1 megawatt. It's in blue because the requirement is on the users to do this bit, and it's the customer's responsibility to report all the fuel, but obviously they're reliant on their suppliers to provide all the correct paperwork to them. This system is administered by Ofgem as opposed to anybody else, but they will do all the same kind of land criteria and greenhouse gas emissions checks that BSL or SFR do. It's also possible to use BSL or SFR fuel, but it's not required, but it does make it a bit easier. And then, like the others, Woodshaw and M+ is required. So a little bit about what's it called, boiler upgrade scheme. So this is a new scheme where you can get £5,000 for installing a biomass boiler. It also covers all the heat pumps. So it's one of the main instruments that's being used to support all the heat pumps in the UK at the minute. There's no sustainability or fuel quality requirements in the bus, but installers are required to advise customers in writing that BSL fuel should be used. And then for really big schemes, the UK emissions trading scheme, so this will be the really big power stations or heat providers, the sustainability requirements are very similar to the self-reporting. So essentially, you have to prove that you're providing sustainable fuel when you're producing heat. So similarly, for systems that produce electricity, so those that are supported by ROCs and CFDs, you've got to, again, prove sustainability. So land criteria, making sure that it's legally harvested, greenhouse gas emissions, although you maybe notice that the greenhouse gas emissions threshold is a bit higher for electricity, and that's to reflect the fact that the conversion of biomass into electricity has a lower efficiency than that of producing heat. So you're allowed to produce more CO2. Again, unlike RHI, for ROCs and CFDs, you don't need Woodshaw or M+. So you don't have to meet the fuel quality requirements. But there is an accreditation scheme for big systems, which is the Sustainable Biomass Programme. It's very similar to something like BSL, but it is specifically for large installations, and it's helpful to assist people with self-reporting. So as I said, it's really important if you're thinking about producing a crop to understand what your end user will be and what their requirements are going to be, because they vary slightly from policy to policy. Okay, moving on to fuel quality and fuel standards. Okay, so on the right hand side, this is an RHI emissions certificate. These are issued by boiler manufacturers, and they effectively say, if this boiler uses this fuel, its emissions of NOx, so nitrous oxides, sorry, covering my camera there, nitrous oxides and particulate matter will be this. And these emission certificates are submitted with the RHI application. So if you've got a system that is below a certain size, then you have to rely on these to prove that you're not going to be affecting local air quality. If you've got a bigger system, I'll come on to this in a minute, but if you've got a bigger system, then you have to rely on environmental permit, which goes into even more detail about what you can emit. So this emission certificate, it specifies exactly what fuel should be used in that boiler, and it specifies exactly what the quality of that fuel is in terms of moisture content and all sorts of other things. Similarly, for the boiler upgrade scheme, you've got to have these emission certificates lodged, but for ROCs and CFDs, then you're more likely to be having a permit, so the fuel quality must match what's in the permit. What am I talking about when I talk about fuel standards? So on the left-hand side is a snippet of a page from the fuel standard for wood chip. But there's a huge suite of different fuel standards that come under this EN ISO 17225 standard, which you can get from BSI. Effectively, this suite of standards covers all sources of biomass, including things like algae and animal wastes and seeds, etc. I'm just showing you the one here for wood chip. As you can see, there's different columns with different different qualities, A, B, 1 and 2. And you can see that it covers things like particle size, moisture content, ash, bulk density, various other things. You'll notice there's A1, 2, B1 and 2. If we flick back just a second to the previous screen, so you can see in the emission certificate there at the bottom, the emission certificate is for A1 and A2 wood chips. So basically in this boiler, we can supply wood chips that meet quality A1 or A2. So that's either of those first two columns. So we know we've got to meet moisture content of less than 25% if it's A1 or less than 30%. And then there's different sizes that we've got to meet as well. So that's quite a detailed and difficult thing for a layperson to understand, isn't it? I think it's quite difficult. Anyway, I'll explain how it can be made a little bit easier in a second. But your invoices have also got to say what the standard is that your fuel meets, so that everything ties together. And when you're being audited, you can see that the fuel that's being supplied meets what's on the emission certificate, meets what's applied to the RHI, and everything hangs together. So I've mentioned Woodshaw and EM Plus. Haven't mentioned ready to burn, but these are all quality assurance schemes, and these are essentially schemes that people can sign up to, which just make sure that they're following the procedures to be able to make sure that the fuel that they produce meet the quality control and the quality standards that I've just mentioned in the previous slide. So EM Plus is for wood pellets. Woodshaw is for everything that's not wood pellets, so chip, log, briquettes, sawdust, anything else that's woody fuel but's not pellets. And then ready to burn is for retailers of domestic logs for use in open fires and stoves when they're supplying more than 2 cubic meters. All of these involve various degrees of desk-based or on-site audits, and there's subscription fees to be paid. As I said earlier, if you've got an RHI accredited system, then you now have to meet Woodshaw accreditation, and that came in April 2022. And from November 2023, there was a bit of a hiatus. They paused the requirement for EN Plus whilst there was an embargo placed on any Russian pellets. So during the kind of transition from us being able to find alternative sources of pellets, they've paused the requirement for EN Plus, but that will come back into effect on I think the 22nd of November 2023. So all these schemes are there to help ensure that suppliers are using the correct processes to help them meet those standards from the last slide. A little bit more now about local air quality emissions. The key contaminant from biomass burning, are NOx, nitrous oxides, and particulates, so dust, basically. And both of those can affect respiratory health. But with bigger permits, you sometimes also see limits on carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide. And as I said earlier, during the planning application process, you might need to provide an air quality assessment, and a consultant will help you, not myself, but somebody who's very good at air quality assessment will be able to produce you a report that you can supply as part of your planning application to check that the system wouldn't affect local health issues. It's also just worth saying here that waste permitting when it comes to burning is not relevant because energy crops are not wastes. So that's unlike a lot of biomasses, but a lot of sources of biomass which are wastes. And that's a good thing because burning waste involves a lot more onerous permitting. But permitting does come into play when you've got big systems, even when you're not burning waste. So for systems that are bigger than 1 megawatt of thermal energy, so that's about an 800 kilowatt system when you're talking about the output, then the medium combustion plant directive comes into play. So just to give you an idea of scale, 800 kilowatts is going to be probably a large secondary school kind of size boiler. And then an even larger system, so the kind of likes of Drax, will be having to deal with large combustion plant directive. So permits describe the fuel, the combustion systems, the filtering equipment, and all the testing that's required. And generally, if you've got a permit, then you have to test, you have to actually have somebody go and stick some probes into your flue every 3 years and test what's coming out of the flue. If you've got an RH system that doesn't have a permit, then you are relying entirely on your emissions certificate, which I showed you earlier, which means you don't have to have any of the testing done, and you're just saying that at some point somebody tested one of these boilers with this fuel and it gave these emissions, and those emissions are below the threshold, so tick, my system is compliant. So for the boiler upgrade scheme, the emissions certificate is still relevant as well. And basically, if your fuel is not on your emissions certificate, then you can't use that fuel in that boiler. So you can't just switch from, say, I don't know, say using one wood chip one day to using pellets made of miscanthus the next, without having to have either a new emissions certificate or perhaps that emission certificate already has those two fuels on it. So I mentioned that energy crops themselves are not a waste, and so waste regs aren't relevant for the burning, but when it comes to ash disposal, I'm afraid you are talking about waste regulations. But it's perfectly okay that once the ash is cooled, it can be disposed of in the commercial waste stream, as long as you've spoken to your waste contractor about that. And also for smaller systems, if you're burning less than 50 kilograms an hour, then you can spread the ash to land, but you do need a U10 for the spreading and a U4 for the burning exemption, which you can get from the Environment Agency for free, but you have to be able to spread that ash at quite a low level, quite a low rate, so you do need a fair bit of land even when you've got quite a small boiler. For larger systems, if you want to spread to land, that's possible too, but you do need a proper permit for that, and that's the number of the permit that you need. And you can also use ash in construction, so you can use it to create concrete as an aggregate. But whether you're spreading it to land or whether you're using it in construction, the use is very dependent on the composition of the ash, and that is very dependent in turn on the material that you've burnt and the type of system that you've burnt it in. So you must talk to somebody who knows a lot more than even I do about this when it comes to using the ash. So this is my final slide, or last but one. Just some words around health and safety. It's always worth being aware of some of the specific health and safety issues surrounding biomass. And the key things are that self-combustion fire, there's always potential for self-combustion when you're piling up material, and particularly when it's wet and when the stacks are high. I think there was some studies done a little while ago. You do have to go quite high and you do have to be quite wet before this becomes an issue, but it is worth bearing in mind. Also, you should be aware of dust and spores, so it's always a good idea to wear good fitting masks when you're handling fuel and ash. It's always a good idea also to carry a carbon monoxide monitor and follow confined space good practice, because carbon monoxide can build up in fuel stores, particularly confined fuel stores, and there have actually been some fatalities when people have entered fuel stores without realising that they were full of carbon monoxide. So in summary, it's really important to make sure that you know which type of system and what kind of size you're going to be supplying to, and making sure that you build those good, strong supplier user partnerships to make sure that the correct fuel goes into the correct system and all the paperwork is right. And of course, good housekeeping when it comes to record keeping is really important for auditing purposes. And there's, like I said, there's many different ways that you can produce biomass, and not all of those have positive environmental impacts. And all the impacts, all the pathways tend to be scrutinised in roughly the same way by regulators. And this might make it seem like these rules and regulations are very, very burdensome. But actually, it means that the really good pathways like energy crops going into heat, they are more likely to be a commercial success because they can navigate the pathway, the regulations more easily, and they tick the boxes. So so that ultimately they do provide a benefit, a commercial benefit to the suppliers and the users of the good pathways. So although there is a lot of detail and there is a lot of paperwork, it's ultimately there for a very good reason, and to help support industry and make it so that the government can continue to support the things that are the right thing to do. So I think that's everything. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to pass back to Kevin.
Thank you, Jill. So you've managed to condense 700 pages into about 15 slides there, which is quite an effort. And I think you've pretty much done justice to my introduction there. Wow. So I've got a couple of questions from the chat there. Mary DeMambro again. Are the rules also relevant for pyrolysis of wood to generate heat electricity, producing biochar?
So there's definitely yes. I mean, broadly, yes. The answer to that is yes. The sustainability, the legality, the greenhouse gas emissions, the local air quality emissions. The things that might be slightly different will probably be things like BSL and SFR probably won't apply. I presume that you'd be thinking about producing electricity from your pyrolysis. So you're going to be looking at probably CFDs, advanced technologies. So yeah, some things will be very similar, some things will be slightly different, but yes, more or less the same.
Okay, and a question from Simon Rochester. With increasing worldwide pressure to significantly reduce CO2 emissions, does the panel have a view on the midterm future of burning biomass? Is there a danger of a ban on biomass burning? Okay,
shall I answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the answer to that is that you really need to look at things at organisations like the IPCC and the Committee on Climate Change. So both of those organisations have said very publicly that biomass does have a role to play in net zero. I think how that happens is very variable between different organisations who you listen to. So if you listen to the CCC, they say that biomass use in heat is going to be still relevant, but quite niche. So very specific to areas that are off the gas grid, and where electricity is limited, electricity connections are limited. But the CCC have said very, very strongly that biomass with carbon capture and storage is going to be incredibly important for the future for net zero. So because obviously that will bring negative emissions and it will counteract the emissions from fossil fuels that we are going to have. We are still going to have fossil fuels in the future, no matter what, I'm sure. And so we're going to have negative emissions from things like BECCS, biomass energy, carbon capture and storage, where the emissions are taken out effectively from the atmosphere before they're released in by the flue.
So Caroline,
the question.
Caroline, you've got a view as well.
You're on mute.
I am. Yeah, I could put a forestry spin on this as well, because when you look at biomass, i.e. logs come from trees. Biomass comes from trees. One of the main markets for our broadleaf woodland within the UK, particularly in England, has been for the log market. That drives woodland management, and woodland management produces better timber. Better timber can go into construction, which is a really efficient way of locking up carbon. Often the carbon, you'll see the calculations stop at the forest gate, and they don't look at what harvested wood products can do for locking up carbon.
Excellent. Okay, so now we enter the panel debate, and I've got a couple of questions that I think will that both of you can answer in from the different perspectives. So for Caroline first, the level of planting in England has been really low over the last, and this is with very nice grants available, up to £10,000 per hectare. Do you think there is a cause and effect there between the amount of hurdles that people have to go through in order to plant a tree and the fact that they're not doing it even with the huge incentives that are possible?
Yeah, I've just done a podcast on this actually for Tree Talk, and yes, the money's great. Land availability, I talked about the low risk map from the Forestry Commission. You know, we've mapped the UK within an inch of its life of where woodland creation can happen, and it is the process. If you look north of the border, trees went in the ground quite quickly because the minister at that time, Fergus Ewing, said it will happen, and the arms length bodies, Forestry Commission, etc., had to make it happen. The process is horrible for UCO, which is our current grant scheme, and going forward, looking at environmental land management scheme, I would just plea to DEFRA to simplify the process because it is horrible.
So Jill, on the other perspective, we're kind of in a fight against climate change here, and in a race to get to net zero by 2050. Surely, with all of those rules and regulations, that's going to put a lot of people off, and we might as well not bother. Is that not the how? Because I'm looking at it and thinking, wow, there's a lot of people who are going to think, wow, that is hard. What do you think? Do we need to go fewer strings?
Well, I think a big challenge is good. We need a big no action without a big challenge, right? I mean, there's a lot of strings, yeah, that's true. But as I said, they're in place now. That, you know, that 70-page, those 70 pages, they're there, they're out there. People are digesting them, and actually, once you've decided upon what you're going to do and a route you're going to do it, and you've understood all of the things that are relevant in those 70 pages to what you're doing, it's full steam ahead, isn't it? You know, you only really have to understand those things once. So yeah, it's hard, but I think a challenge. You know, we've done a lot in terms of resolving big environmental challenges in the past, and we can do it again.
And the next question is, and I don't mean to sound that I'm someone who doesn't want to fight climate change with biomass boilers, because of course that's what I do. But there will be people out there that think, stuff that for a game of soldiers. I'm going to stick a boiler in and no one's going to ever find out. And similarly, some people are going to think, stuff that this is my land, I'm going to plant trees, and they can come and find me if they want. Who is checking that you're doing the right thing? Caroline, what do you think? Is there anyone checking that you've planted 5 hectares?
I mean, it's within a new environment bill that the Forestry Commission have enforcement rights to particularly on deforestation actually, but certainly on afforestation. You'd be surprised, neighbours know what's going on and they will report you.
And what would happen if you had a 5-year-old crop of trees? Can you retrospectively apply, or is it a case of just having to rip it out?
You know what, I don't know actually. That's a good question, Kevin.
And similarly for Jill, who's checking that that someone is doing the right thing with their biomass system? Is it a case of just seeing some smoke and reporting? And who would you report to if that was the case?
So if you decided tomorrow to go and put a biomass boiler in without any kind of subsidy, well, first of all, probably wouldn't want to do that because it's probably cheaper for you to use LPG or oil at the minute. But just suppose LPG and oil went up through the roof and it suddenly became very much more beneficial to put in a biomass system. So a lot of those things that I was talking about, a lot of them aren't what you wouldn't need to worry about because they're all tied with the incentive schemes. But as I said, environmental permitting would still apply. So you'd have to put in a very big boiler though before environmental permitting for the burning would come into play. So remember, it was 800 kilowatts. So yeah, if you, for example, suddenly decided you're going to build a big factory and put in a biomass boiler, then yes, then it becomes an environmental permitting issue, and the people who would be looking for you would be the Environment Agency and planning as well, of course. So it would be quite difficult to go under the radar because of that sort of size. It would stand out.
So when Caroline said before you do anything, check with the Forestry Commission, who would you check with before you put in a biomass boiler, just to make sure? Would it be your local authority just to? Or...
Yeah, you're planning.
Okay.
Kevin, Kevin, going back to felling, of course, you know, there are regulations for felling, and if you do want to supply timber into a compliant RHI facility, then you have to prove you're legal and sustainable, and the felling license is one of them.
Absolutely, and that's possibly going to be another webinar in the future, I think. I've got there was one other thing there. Oh yes, the boiler upgrade scheme. That seems pretty retrograde, surely, to take away the sustainability and the quality aspects. After all of the effort to get those into the RHI, what's all that about?
Interesting, isn't it? I know it's because it's gone from being a scheme that pays for ongoing generation of energy. So basically, with the RHI, you submit your meter readings and then you get paid. With the boiler upgrade scheme, it's an upfront payment. You get it right at the beginning. So there is no way of government essentially kind of refusing to pay you if you're not complying going forward. There's no way for them to require it. So yeah, I think governments found that if they remove the incentives for things like that in the way that they had previously supplied them, then they have no leg to stand on in terms of regulation of a lot of these things. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that if anyone wants to have a little bit of a laugh after this webinar, go and see another Groucho Marx clip, Marx Brothers, A Night at the Opera. And it's if you search on YouTube for There Ain't No Sanity Clause, I think you'll find that highly amusing, because it's all about a contract between two people. Very good fun. Could we go back to the slides? I just got a couple. I just want to say thank you to Caroline and Jill also, because frankly, that's an amazing job and very dry subject, but you've both made it into bite-sized, digestible chunks. So thank you very much for that. So this is the last webinar in the current season, I know it's a real desperate sadness to me as well, but we will be back for season 2 in September 2023, and just look at the delights, the box of delights that we've got coming towards you. So hopefully by then we'll have a juicy biomass strategy which will have lots of potential for growing and using biomass crops, some incentives, who knows, from the ELMS scheme, the SFI, that sort of thing, stacking and biodiversity net gain, etc. We also want to look at some of these alternatives again, like seaweed and hemp, which I think you'll be very, very interested in, and also the ability of willow miscanthus short rotation forestry to help with flood mitigation and water quality. These crops, of course, have a tremendous potential for that because they're so closely planted, so they really can stem the flow for flood mitigation. So all that to come in September 23. So sign up to biomassconnect.org and make sure that you're aware of those in advance. Next slide, please. So just a word to say, these are the partners in the project, and of course Department of Energy and Security and Net Zero, who sponsor the whole Biomass Connector project and the Biomass Feedstocks Innovation Programme. And final slide, please. And I always see this and think that it's a little bit like, who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, with the arrow there. But anyway, please go to our various social media handles and stay connected with us. But without anything further, oh, one final thing, of course, if you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe to us and click a like. So anyway, thank you again to the speakers, and see you in September. Goodbye.